Okay, so good morning, everyone. Today we'll be going over Chapter 5, the Integumentary System. What's nice about this particular chapter is that I think it really flows from the last chapter where we were talking about different types of tissues, because we'll be talking about things like epithelial tissue and connective tissue and how they're part of the integumentary system. And the integumentary system, it's almost like we're starting to go through the body systems from the outside in, so it makes sense that we would start with the skin. Again, kind of it encloses everything. It's almost like if you think of the plasma membrane of a cell, the integumentary system would almost be like the plasma membrane of a human. So this week, make sure you've answered study guide questions for Chapter 5. We'll be discussing those on Tuesday, and we'll be going over maybe some of those answers at the end of class that day. This week, just recognize that there's no quiz on Friday. We actually have our first exam on Thursday, so there will be no quiz this week. On the following Monday, you will still have your adaptive practice due. So your homework 6, your adaptive practice for Chapter 6 is going to be due next Monday. And we're going to start digging into the muscles and bones kind of part of this course, which I think a lot of you are going to be very excited about, just because it plays such an important role. Or not an important role, but it is kind of the focus of a lot of your future careers for those of you who are interested in PT and maybe medicine. I think muscles and bones kind of tend to be where people think they're going to learn about when they take an anatomy and physiology course, which again will be a nice bulk of our course this year. So the study guide questions, just a quick rundown here as we're going through them. We're going to be looking over the general structures of skin, talking about some of the different types of skin cells. We'll be talking about different types, what's the molecular basis for different types of skin colors, structures of hair, talk about thin versus thick, talk about some of the functions of skin, how wounds heal, part of the epidermis, and then finish up talking about aging and disorders of the integumentary system. If you have been watching lectures, you'll notice that there's kind of a very common structure to the way that these chapters are put together. So it's this kind of general introduction, talking about cells and structure, talking about function, then kind of wrapping up and talking about things, the processes of aging, and as well as disorders. So again, if you are a person who thrives off of structure, you hopefully have started to recognize that that's what's happening in each of these chapters. Okay, so the integumentary system, if we define what it is, and then everything that it kind of encapsulates, you obviously are going to be thinking skin, hair, oil, and sweat glands, which are kind of, I think we can think of when we think about skin and hair, nails, and sensory receptors that are innervating. So in terms of what the integumentary system does, it's going to help to maintain body temperature. It's very important for whole body homeostasis, converts inactive vitamin D to its active form, so it helps us process that particular vitamin, provides sensory information, so it helps us interact with our environment and interpret the world around us, and helps maintain homeostasis in another number of ways. Again, it kind of keeps certain things out, allows not every microbe that we come in contact with it to enter our body. So it's kind of our first layer of protection in a lot of ways from a lot of different things. We could be talking about microbes, we could be talking about environmental factors. So it really has a big role in protection. So if you are looking at the PowerPoint, feel free to click on the integumentary system here, and that will give you an opportunity to watch a video provided by Wiley Plus. If you find these videos useful, then this is your opportunity to watch a nice introductory video on that. So as I said a few slides ago, homeostasis is important for the body to maintain its function, and the integumentary system plays a huge role in that. So you can see here, if we look at the integumentary system, it plays a role in homeostasis of the skeletal system, so helps activate vitamin D needed for proper absorption of dietary calcium. Obviously, calcium is going to be an important component of bones and bone formation. For the muscle system, again, provides calcium needed for muscle contraction. For the nervous system, you have nerve endings that are innervating all of the integumentary system, so we can interact with our environment and essentially receive that sensory information, whether you're talking about things like temperature or touch. The endocrine system, the keratinocytes help activate vitamin D for calcitrol that helps absorb dietary calcium. So you can kind of see, again, a very common theme here that the role of calcium is important in the body. And the integumentary system is kind of where that processing for that starts. So chemical changes in the dermis cause widening and narrowing of the blood vessels, and so that's how it interacts with the cardiovascular system. And then the lymphatic system, it's again the very first line of defense. It's going to prevent outside microbes or viruses from entering all parts of the system. So it really does help protect your body from essentially absorbing any or interacting with any type of microbe that it encompasses. The macrophages in the dermis actually phagocytize those microbes, and we'll talk about that a little later on in this particular lecture. In the respiratory system, the hairs in the nose filter dust particles from the air, so your first layer of protection of the air that you inhale is right there at that mucosal membrane in your nose. The digestive system again has an important role or important dependency upon vitamin D that helps dietary calcium get absorbed so it can go throughout the body and interact with things like the skeletal system and the muscular system. And then the urinary system, again, the role of vitamin D and calcium is very important there. And lastly, the reproductive system. You also have a lot of parts of the integumentary system that's involved with reproduction. Even we talk about infants and their interaction with skin contact is very important, but you can also think of the nipple as being part of the integumentary system. That's obviously a very important food source for infants. So let's start by talking about the overall structure of skin and the different layers of skin. First, you have two major layers. You've got the epidermis, which is going to be the most superficial layer, kind of the layer when we talk about skin, that's probably what you're imagining. And so that superficial layer still has sublayers within it, and we'll talk about those and talk about the different types of cells that make up those layers. So your epidermis, that's the visual, most superficial part of your skin. Dermis is going to be a layer that's deeper to the epidermis. This is where you're going to see far more vascularization, and if the dermis is punctured, that's where bleeding would occur. So epidermis is far more superficial. That's the skin cells kind of on the surface, but still very important. And then the dermis is going to be the deeper layer that provides some of the important nutrients and nerve endings to the epidermis. The hypodermis is also called the subcutaneous layer, located deep to the dermis, but it's not considered a layer of skin. It's composed of areolar and adipose tissue. If we remember what adipose tissue is, it's essentially kind of your fat layer for your body. And so that's going to be important for thermal regulation, making sure that you're not losing too much heat, helps keeps you insulated. Can also be a source of metabolic glucose as well if it's broken down. So that hypodermis is deep to the dermis, but the two major layers that we'll be talking about today are going to be the epidermis and the dermis. And so that's going to be the next couple slides. So if we actually look at a cross section of what skin looks like, we'll just start here with the two components that we just talked about. The epidermis, that's again the most superficial layer that we visually see with our eyes, and then closer deep to that, you have the dermis, and you can see here it consists of the papillary region and the reticular region, and we'll talk about those two regions when we get to that section. And then the subcutaneous layer that you see here is composed of those adipose tissue. That's what these are, those fat cells. You can also see there are blood vessels as veins and arteries that are creating vascularization in this region. You'll notice that there's a lot more vascularized regions there in your dermis. Your epidermis doesn't have as much vascularization, and we'll talk about how those two layers are different. So whenever you look at a figure like this, it can be very easy to get overwhelmed very quickly because there are a lot of labels here, but start first with like the biggest labels, the bigger chunks, and then kind of work your way down from there. And I think that usually kind of conceptually helps you understand, okay, these are the big two chunks that we're talking about, and then each of these smaller labels are kind of parts of those chunks, and putting it kind of together in your own head. So again, the two major sections of skin, epidermis, epidermis, dermis, and then subcutaneous layer. So if we look at the epidermal layer, you can see here that there are some free nerve endings that are present. You can also see that there are hairs present here. The hair shaft is present. Epidermal ridges. So if we're talking about our fingertips, those are going to be the ridges that are responsible for creating our fingerprints. And you also have dermal papillae. You can see here that there's also capillary loops that are present, little loops of arteries and veins, again, that are providing some sort of vascularization to these deeper layers of the epidermis. Present also are things like the sweat pore. So this is how your sweat is going to be released onto the surface of your skin. You can see deeper to that your sebaceous oil gland. And if we look at kind of the structure there, we've talked about in the past the different structures of glands, so you can kind of see what that sebaceous oil gland looks like there, and we'll talk about that structure a little bit more when we can talk about the dermal layer. Corpuscle touch, or Meissner's corpuscle. This is essentially an innervation. This is a nerve of one of the ways that we are able to detect touch on our epidermis. And you can see here we're getting more, if this is kind of the different layer, the regions. You can see as part of the dermis, you have your erector pili muscle. So this is a muscle that allows the hairs on your skin to rise up in cases of, fight or fright. Or it's also in instances of, if you're very cold, goosebumps develop, that's the muscle that kind of activates the raising of your hairs. You can see deep to that, you have your hair follicle, your hair root. We'll break this down a little bit later. You can see the eccrine sweat gland and the apocrine sweat gland here and here. Notice that their structures are slightly different, and where they kind of release their sweat to is in slightly different regions. You can see that the eccrine sweat gland is just releasing sweat to the surface of the skin, and the apocrine actually gives rise to this area here near the base of the hair shaft. And then you have a Piscean corpuscle. This is again very important in sensing our environment. And then we have our sensory nerves, adipose tissue, these fat cells here in the subcutaneous layer, and the cutaneous vascular corplex, which is just the vascularization that we see as part of the subcutaneous layer. So we slowly but surely have gone through kind of all of the different parts of this particular figure. But again, just it's best to start off with the larger portions that make the most sense, things like the epidermis and dermis. And then as we're going through the presentation of each one of these sections, each one of these kind of components are going to be presented. So this is almost like a synopsis of everything that we'll be talking about in the first part of this lecture. So don't get overwhelmed by this. We're just going to go through these things one by one and kind of talk about their role in the integumentary system. But it's nice to kind of see everything put together and where it's located at in a cross section of skin. And this would probably be a nice place to just come back and revisit too, especially if you're a visual learner. Having figures like this can be very useful because you can conceptually start to put things together in your mind. And you might even use a slide like this to just take this slide, and then as we're going through the more specific information about each part of this, maybe just writing a one-word synopsis of what that part or the function of that area or region is. So here's further images of the integumentary system. So the last one was a cartoon. Here you can see some beautiful electron micrograph images. So it's showing you the difference between the epidermis and the dermis. You can also see a hair shaft here, as well as the follicle. So again, this is what it actually looks like in the human body. This is a further kind of zoomed in picture. This is actually SEM, scanning electron microscopy. And you can see here both the dermal and the epidermal layer, what they look like if you were to zoom in very closely to these cells and see what they look like in their terms of their structure. This is a nice piece of histology, just showing you the different layers of the epidermis. We'll talk about each one of these layers here, so don't get, again, too bogged down in these different words quite yet. We'll go through each layer of the epidermis here in a second. And then if we're going to actually look at, any of you can probably just lift up your hand and look at your fingertips right here. You can see your own representation of your epidermal ridges, and then there are also the presence of sweat pores. So if you are particularly, let's say this first exam comes and you're starting to get a little worried, it's possible that those sweat pores in your hands are going to get activated and you'll maybe get some sweaty palms. So that's where those sweat pores are located, are right there next to those epidermal ridges. Okay, so the epidermis. So there are different layers for the epidermis, but first we're going to talk about what those layers are composed of. So what are the major players in the epidermis? What types of cells do we see in the epidermis? And so the first type of cell that we see are keratinocytes. If we break down the root word meaning keratin is horn, so these look like horn cells, which makes sense if you actually look at what a keratinocyte looks like. You can see how it has those kind of spiky projections on them. This is a type of this is kind of 90% of the epithelial cells. So this is just a tough fibrous protein that provides structure to these cells. Keratinocytes are a majority of the types of cells that we'll see here. Melanocytes are the next type of cell that we'll talk about. Melanocytes produce melanin. Melanin is the kind of the color, melanin is the color producing or pigment producing cell in this region. So all of the skin tone, skin color that each of us have, that's produced by these melanin granules that are released by melanocytes. We'll talk about situations in which melanin is kind of increased. So if you, let's say this afternoon was a beautiful day and you went and sat out in the sun and maybe got a little bit of a tan, your melanocytes have gotten activated and they're releasing melanin to your skin to make your skin a little bit darker. And the reason it's actually protecting the nuclei of the other cells in that region, mainly the keratinocytes, because it's creating a nice protective layer to block the UV light from those keratinocytes. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in this later on in this lecture. Next, you have intraepidermal macrophages or Langerhans cells. So a macrophage is an immune cell. And those immune cells are going to be finding and attacking any type of bacterial invader that's located on the surface of your skin. And so this is kind of the first line of defense of the immune system are these Langerhans cells or these macrophages that are present that can essentially engulf these microbes via phagocytosis and break them down. So again, it's kind of the first line of our defense of our immune system. And next you have the tactile epithelial cells or the Merkel cells. These Merkel cells are going to be important for providing information to the sensory neuron. So we are talking about things like pressure and touch. These are going to be the cells that are giving the body that information. So even as you are sitting in your chair, you probably don't even think about it right now, what that feels like on your bottom. And all of those cells are being activated in that region. So now that I'm bringing it to your attention, you're probably thinking about it a little more. Or if you're resting your hands on your desk, think about right now you have all these Merkel cells that are actually being activated by that pressure that's being provided by the weight of your body or the gravity that's being applied to your body on that desk. So again, this is another example of the way the nervous system innervates into the epidermis and is able to receive that information. So for the epidermis, there are essentially two different types of skin. So those are the major cell players. But when we look at the types of skin, you think about the different regions of your body. You have regions that are very have thin, hairy skin that covers all regions except for your palmar surface of digits and soles. So if you look at the palms of your hands, you don't necessarily have the hair on those regions. But if you look at the back of your hand or your arms, these are going to be thin skin that covers that has hair on it. If you think about thick hairless skin, that's going to be your palms, your palmar surface, your digits, and your soles. So the bottom of your feet, the palms of your hand, those are going to be thicker regions of skin, and these are not going to have hair or hair follicle innervation. So you should not have hair being expressed on your hands or your palm of your hands. But you know, the world is a very diverse place. In some instances, you know, obviously there's exceptions to this rule, but for the majority of folks, those are going to be regions that hair is not found. Okay, so if we look further at the epidermis, there are layers within the epidermis itself. And so you have your epidermis, you have your dermis, you have your hypodermis. And if we look at the epidermis itself, there are different layers to the epidermis. And so the epidermis, you've got 4 layers in thin skin and 5 layers in thick skin. So they are from deep to superficial, meaning we're going from the bottom to essentially the top, bottom from the top. Yeah, just song popped into my head. So the stratum basal, again, anytime you see the word base or basal, you should probably think bottom, think basement membrane. The stratum basal is the deepest portion. So this is where you have cuboidal cells, keratinocytes, or columnar keratinocytes. This is also the place where you're going to see stem cells, meaning that this is where you're going to see an increase or a lot of cells being made and that are going to be regenerated, and this is the layer of skin that kind of regenerates and keeps regenerating those keratinocytes that kind of filter up through these layers and eventually die and slough and are lost. So this very deep layers where you see actively dividing cells, actively dividing cells, these stem cells that can differentiate into keratinocytes, and then slowly as they work their way up the layers, eventually die off and slough off. This is where you have tough keratin intermediate fibers. You have melanocytes in this region as well as tactile epithelial cells in the stratum basal. The stratum spinosum, this is superficial to the stratum basal. You have keratinocytes of 8 to 10 layers there. They're flattened. They're not going to be the cuboidal shape that we saw in the layer underneath of that. They're going to be intraepidermal macrophages located here, as well as melanocytes. And then they're going to be a connection between the stratum basal and the stratum spinosum via desmosome. So we were talking about junctions in the last lecture. So there's going to be desmosomes that are connecting these two. But again, the shape of the keratinocytes is going to change between your stratum basal and your stratum spinosum. You're going to have your cuboidal shape here, and here they're going to become a little bit more flattened, which as we move up the different surface layers, you're going to notice that these cells are going to become far more flattened, far more less viable. They're going to die, and that's what's going to provide the outer layers of our skin. Okay, stratum granulosum. So these are basically 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes. You'll notice that there are different numbers of layers per each different sublayer. The cells are starting to die at this point in time. They have laminar granules, which are fibers with membrane, and they have these lipid secretions that are released. So these lipid secretions that are released in the stratum granulosum act as a water protectant for the outer layers of the skin. So keratinocytes. I don't even know if it's worth me drawing this because it's just so hard to read. So this is 8 to 10 layers here. So these 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes, again, you're starting to see this keratinocytes go through the process of apoptosis, or what is called cell death. So the more superficial these cells get, the closer they get to dying, and then providing those outer layers of skin. Okay, so the stratum lucidium, this is only present in thick skin. This is the kind of the translucent layer of skin that we see on our, soles of our feet and the palms of our hands. There's 6 layers of keratinocytes here that are producing this kind of thicker layer of skin in these different regions that we see in thick skin. Stratum corneum, this is kind of our last layer, and this is one of our thicker layers. You've got 25 to 30 cell layers of keratinocytes that are present here. There's no organelles present in this keratinocytes at that point in time. They've completely died. And these are going to be the keratinocytes that are being shed and replaced pretty consistently. So the more superficial that you get, the less kind of alive the keratinocytes are. At your very deep layer, your stratum basal, again, you've got the cuboidal, the columnar shape. Those are stem cells. They're rapidly dividing. Stratum spinosum, you've got 8 to 10 layers. They're becoming flattened. In the granulosum, those are 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes. You start to see that they're lacking organelles and undergoing apoptosis. And the stratus corneum, you've got those layers of 25 to 30, and at this point they've undergone apoptosis, and those are dead cells, dead layers of cells on the very outside of your skin that can be shed in that state, and then also replaced by that underlying layer of the stratum basal. So that's just a pretty quick synopsis of the different layers of skin. And sorry, I just wanted to make sure I was keeping the number of keratinocytes clear there. So I do have a few notes that I'm kind of looking off of. Okay, so if we look at what this actually looks like in the body, again, you can see your deep layer here, your superficial layer here. So this would be, the outside world. Your superficial layer is exposed to the outside world. So if we start in the deep layer, in the list that we just talked about, again, your stratum basal is your very bottom, your very deep layer here. You can see those cells have that cuboidal shape. You have the tactile epithelial cells present there that are interacting with that sensory neuron that is allowing the cells to interpret pressure and touch. You'll also see deep to that you have some dermal layers, and that's providing some of the vascularization to that area. We also will notice that there are some melanocytes there that are producing the coloring or pigmentation to the skin. We'll talk more about melanocytes here in a second. Those intraepidermal macrophages, again, are going to be looking for any type of foreign invader to the body. And those are going to exist probably a little bit more in this stratum spinosum. You can see those, the shape of those cells. They're a little less cuboidal. They're flattened, getting more flattened at this point in time. The stratum granulosum, the cells are starting to undergo apoptosis. You can see there's laminar granules are present in that. And then stratum lucidum, those are going to be present in those thicker areas of skin. You can see they're kind of clear. If you look at your skin in your palms, you'll notice that there's maybe kind of a little bit of a clear layer there. And then stratum corneum, that outermost or most superficial layer, you've got dead keratinocytes, and because they're dead, they're very flattened at that point in time. They've undergone apoptosis, and they're anywhere from 25 to 30 dead cells deep. So again, just kind of going from your deep to your superficial. I'm not quite sure if there's a way to kind of come up with a mnemonic device to kind of keep each one of these straight. I guess it would be BSGLC would be, if you were going to do some type of mnemonic device, might be worth creating one of those just to kind of prompt your memory on the test to be like, oh, what's the order from deep to superficial? And so a mnemonic device might be a very useful study technique with something like this, again, because it's very vocabulary based. And when I say mnemonic device, it would just be BSGLS, and or C. And I don't have one personally, so I'll have to leave it up to you and your creativity to come up with something. Okay, so the epidermal strata, this is just a really nice synopsis. Basically, if you'd like to see a written form of what we talked about in that first slide. So again, the basal layer, deepest layer, you've got stem cells undergoing cell division, producing those new keratinocytes and replacing the ones that are being slept off on the outermost layer. Melanocytes and epithelial cells are present there, the tactile epithelial cells. Spinosum, 8 to 10 rows, bundles of keratin-mediated fibers. Melanocytes and intraepidermal macrophages are present there. Granulosum, you're starting to get flattened keratinocytes and producing keratinohyaline, which converts keratin intermediate filaments to keratin. And then these lipid-rich water-repellent secretion granules, these laminar granules that create a protective layer for the skin. Luceum, only present in the skins and soles of fingertips, and 4 to 6 row of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes. And then corneum, just a few to 50, so let's say 25 to 50 of dead, flattened keratinocytes that contain mostly keratin, no organelles. At that point in time, you've lost a lot of that due to apoptosis, or that cellular death. So apoptosis, I used that term earlier. Maybe I didn't define what it is. Apoptosis that occurs is essentially programmed cellular death. Essentially, these cells are being programmed to die as they go up those layers of the cell. Okay, so that was the epidermis. If we're going to go through the different layers of the next layer, it would be the epidermis, or I'm sorry, we went through the epidermis. Next would be the dermis. So if we look at the dermis, there are these different regions here, the papillary and reticular regions of the dermis. And so we can see kind of how those divvy up between the two types. You've got about 4/5 of the dermis that are the reticular area. Region, and then about 1/5 is going to be the papillary. So this is going to be the more superficial portion of the dermis, and that's got the areolar connective tissue, elastic fibers, and houses blood capillaries, and there's corpuscles of touch and free nerve endings. And the reticular is, again, deeper and making up a much larger portion of that, has the connective tissue and collagen. And spaces between fibers contain some adipose tissue, hair follicles, nerves, sebaceous gland. So this is kind of the greater bulk of what the dermis is composed of, and the higher, more superficial region that we saw in that first figure shows you kind of what the difference between the papillary and reticular region are. So I'm guessing we'll probably see a very similar figure here. So, so again, that's the breakdown of the dermis. So if we go back to this figure, I think it's nice to just kind of come back and revisit this. So you can see that papillary region here and that reticular region here, and kind of how the composition of those is slightly different. That papillary region is kind of what kind of bridges the epidermis and dermal region, and you can see all of those capillary loops present that are providing, skin color and things like that. So it's got that nice glow. You can also see the presence of some of the oil glands there, this corpuscles of touch. And then deeper to that, you have your reticular region, which has kind of all of these other structures present there. So the Piscean corpuscule, the hair root, the ericoin and apocrine sweat glands are present there too. So just wanted to come back to this because again, I think it provides a nice visual of these different regions. If you're just reading them off of a slide, I think it's sometimes hard to see how everything really fits together. So coming back to these figures that have what looks like a lot on them, I think can be very helpful because it allows you to kind of place where those are located. And again, structure function relationship, if you know where it's located, that's part of the structure, and hopefully that would give you some indication as to what the function is. Okay, so we've been talking about the different cell types that are present in the epidermis. One cell type that we've revisited multiple times is the melanocyte. So the melanocyte that you can see located here in the basal layer, stratum basal, you can see us producing the pigmentation for the cells. So there are two types of melanin that are produced by the melanocytes. The pheomelanin is going to produce yellow-red tones, and eumelanin is going to produce more of the brown-black tones. In the skin, in terms of the way skin is colored, you also have red hues to skin because of the hemoglobin that's present in the red blood cells that are being circulated. So here you can see under the epidermal layer in the dermis, you've got those vascularized veins, and so arteries and veins, and so that's going to give some of the red glow to the region. And then also the amount of keratin that we ingest is also going to give rise to some of our coloring in our bodies. So keratin is going to be a yellow-orange pigment stored in the stratum corneum and adipose tissue. It's going to be the product of our diet, and so if you're eating, let's say, a lot of carrots, you'll have a lot of keratin in your system, and that can give a yellow-orange pigment. You'd have to be eating a lot of carrots in order for this to change your coloring, but it does can be stored in the stratum corneum in the adipose tissue underneath. So melanin is produced by melanocytes. It produces the coloring of our skin. It's releasing that melanin. What the purpose of the melanin is to protect the surrounding cells from UV damage. So UV rays are released by the sun, and UV rays, if they come into this cell, can go into the nucleus and actually cause damage to the DNA. So DNA is very sensitive to UV light. If you expose DNA to UV light, it can cause mutations, and so mutations ultimately can lead to cellular dysfunction. And so this is essentially kind of the very basic mechanism for how skin cancers arise from overexposure to UV light. There is UV light exposure, it goes into the nucleus of the cell, it causes mutations in the DNA, and that DNA is ultimately going to lead to maybe some dysfunction of the cell, and in some cases it's skin cancer. So essentially melanocytes are trying to protect the cells around it by releasing that coloring. It essentially blocks out that UV light, and by blocking out that UV light, you no longer will have the mutagenic UV light coming into the nuclei of those cells. So when we talk about skin coloring, there are some differences, diseases that can occur. So for example, one of them is albinism. It's a disorder that you have absence of pigment in skin, hair, and eyes due to a defect of the enzyme involved in the production of melanin, which means that essentially you no longer have melanin being produced in those regions. And so if you encounter a human or an animal that has albinism, there's a complete lack of pigmentation. They can appear completely white. So maybe the white lab mice, maybe some of you have seen lab rats or even individuals. There are individuals who also have albinism. This is a genetic disease. So it can be inherited. It's actually a recessive genetic disease. And individuals who have true albinism will actually have red eyes. They won't have any type of pigmentation in their eyes, and so the blood that's circulating into their eyes is what's going to give it that red pigmentation. Vitiligo is a chronic disorder that causes depigmentation in patches of skin, and so there are individuals who maybe are a darker melanin producing type of cell who will have lighter colors of patches where there's just areas of their skin that are no longer producing melanin. And so in terms of that particular disease, the cause isn't unknown. There is some hypothesis that it's genetic and that there might be some role of the immune system. It could possibly be an autoimmune disorder. It's actually a very beautiful model who has vitiligo, and so maybe some of you have seen her pictures, but she has it on her face in a very beautiful pattern. And so again, this is just another example of what happens when you don't have equal production of melanin across all cells in the skin. But these are two disease states that can arise. So we've talked about the epidermis, the dermis, and then deep to that is the hypodermis. It's also called the subcutaneous layer. So for those of you who are interested in the medical field, maybe you've been told or have had to administer a shot or something, what they call sub-Q. And so this would be the layer in which you're injecting a shot into, the subcutaneous layer, and it attaches the skin to the underlying tissues and organs. So here you can see that subcutaneous layer is composed of fat and also is highly vascularized with veins and arteries, but it does kind of connect the integumentary system to the underlying connective tissue that is going to kind of bind the body together. Okay, so we've talked about the different kind of layers of skin, broken down some of the components of those layers and the cell types of those layers. You'll notice that there were a lot of different other things that were in the layers of the skin. So now we're going to talk about some of the accessory structures of the skin, things like sweat glands, hair, and kind of break and nails will also be another accessory structure that we'll talk about that are involved in the integumentary system. So the first obviously is hair. Hair covers almost all of our body with the exceptions again of our palms and the soles of our feet. When we talk about thick versus thin skin, it kind of falls in line with that patterning as well. Hair is composed of dead keratinized epidermal cells. So again, kind of following that pattern that we saw with skin, hair is very similar in the fact that your deeper layers are going to have your live actively dividing cells. And then as you go more superficial, that's where your cells have undergone apoptosis and are actually dead. And then in terms of exactly where and how hair grows, it plays a lot into genetics. So things like male pattern baldness and even female pattern baldness can be inherited from your parents. And in terms of thickness, color, all of that can be inherited genetically from your parents. So if we look at the structure of hair, you can see this really nice SEM picture showing you the skin hair shaft here. You've got these epidermal cells that are around that shaft. Below the level of shaft, you're going to have the follicle, and then far deep to that, you have the root that penetrates into the dermis. So it actually goes all the way through the epidermal layer into the dermis, and you can see the epithelial root sheath and the dermal root sheath are going to be kind of two parts of the base of the hair that we'll look at, and kind of how those different regions are going to have different kind of association factors with that individual hair that is penetrating deep. So we'll look at a cross section of that here in our, do we have a cross section of hair? That we had a figure for that, a cross section of hair. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna go all the way back, probably. Okay, so I like this because it does show you that cross section of the hair follicle and the hair root located here through the dermal layer. So you can see the hair follicle and the hair root in the dermal layer, and then you can also see that it passes through the epidermal layer as well, and how you have these different glands that are associated with it. So here you can see kind of the sebaceous oil gland that's giving rise to that hair root. So if you've ever had an infected hair root, maybe it could be a blocked sebaceous gland that's leading to that. It can also lead, I mean, an infected hair root is going to look a lot essentially like a pimple. So yeah, I again like coming back to this figure because it does show you the different regions. And again, this is a different part of the cross section of the hair. You can see how it goes through the epidermis, also has regions of the papillary region and the reticular region, and through that you have innervation, and then your muscle that is innervated that you can see right here, your erector muscle that's going to be activated by your nervous system. Okay, so I'm surprised that we don't have another figure like that for the accessory structures. Okay, so when hair is growing, you have these different stages. So you have your original growth stage. That's when your actively dividing cells are occurring. You have growth occurring on the length of the hair. So you'll essentially grow a couple millimeters across a month. Your regression stage is when the hair starts to no longer go through the actively dividing stage, and then the resting stage is where your hair is no longer dividing. It is in the process of actively dividing, and in some cases actually leaving the shaft, and so on average, I think the average human's losing anywhere between 70 to 100 hairs a day. And so that's just, again, the normal cycle of hair growth is you've got your growth stage, your regression stage, and then your resting stage. And your resting stage is when the hair will come loose from that follicle and be lost. And it's just kind of part of the cycle of life of hair. Types of hair. When you were born, you had lingo covered all over you. Covers the fetus when the baby comes out. You still have kind of this very soft fuzz that covers the baby. When my son was born, he actually had super hairy ears, which worried me for a second. I was like, oh gosh, our kid's gonna have hairy ears. But that was just part of his langu, which has since sloughed off and he's lost, so he doesn't have hairy ears now. But it is part of kind of just the protective surface that the body creates, and so as the child is born, that over to the first few months of life, all of that hair is lost. The other types of hair you can see here are terminal and vellus. So the terminal hair is going to be long, coarse, heavily pigmented hairs, and the vellus is short, fine, pale hairs. And if you look at the differences between males and females, there's actually a much higher percentage of terminal hair on males. They have a much smaller amount of vellus versus females who have a small amount of terminal hair and then a large amount of vellus. And you can kind of, just think about the different regions of the body and where those would be located at. So if you look at a male arm, they're going to have the probably more terminal types of hair expression on, let's say, their forearms, and a female's going to have more of a vellus type of hair on their forearms, a little bit more fine. Just kind of depends on the individual and kind of where that hair is distributed. So it just kind of, again, depends on the individual, but kind of generally that's how the different sexes have the hair distributed on their bodies. Hair color is going to be due to the amount and type of melanin present in the keratinized cells of the hair. So as you get older, those melanocytes that are producing those melatonin are going to die off. So that's why hair is going to turn from like the normal pigmentation, whether it's blonde, brown, or black, to maybe gray. So the loss of those cells is going to lead to no longer any type of coloring in that hair. Kind of the more melanocytes that you have present, the darker the hair color is going to be in producing the amount of melanin that is coloring the hair. So another accessory structure to the skin is going to be skin glands. And so we'll look here at different types of glands. So sebaceous oil glands, you can see here, are part of the hair follicle. Apocrine glands are going to be the most numerous type of gland. The apocrine sweat glands are located mainly in the hairy areas, and so you can see here kind of an apocrine gland. Eccrine sweat glands are, you can see an example of the cross section of here. So this is your eccrine, this is your apocrine, and the seroneous glands are modified sweat glands located in the ear canal that are going to produce the sebum or the earwax that protects our ear from its outside environment. Sorry. So really quickly, I mislabeled this apocrine. This is actually the sebaceous oil gland that is connected to the oil shaft, the hair shaft that you see here. That's going to produce the oil that essentially coats the base of the hair. So the different types of skin glands are going to help produce different oils that are essentially acting as protectants for the outer layers of the skin. They act as antimicrobials. They prevent microbes from being able to adhere and cause infections to our skin. But any clogging of any of these glands are going to obviously lead to sometimes infection. And so you'll see raised portions of the skin if any of these oil glands are in fact clogged. So if we break down these skin glands and kind of where exactly they're distributed at, the sebaceous, you can see the sebaceous glands are going to be in the lips, the penis, labia minora, the tarsal glands in small in the trunk and limbs. Not going to see them in the palms and soles. So these are the sebaceous oil glands that we just saw. The eccrine sweat glands are through the skin in both regions of the body, especially in the skin and forehead. This is going to be one of the glands that are producing sweat. We see two different types of sweat glands here. One of them is producing the sweat that is going to be important for thermoregulation. The apocrine sweat glands are slightly different. You've got them distributed in the skin of the groin, areolar, bearded regions of face, clitoris, and labrum minora. These are going to be the sweat glands that are going to produce some of the more smelly types of sweat. So this is maybe plays a little bit more role in reproduction. So the two different types of sweat glands are going to serve different functions. The eccrine are going to be a little bit more in thermoregulation, and the apocrine are going to produce the smell that we think of as being associated with sweat. And the ceremonious glands are going to be present in the external auditory canal. And again, we talked about kind of how they're important in producing things like earwax. Okay, so in terms of the location of the secretory portion, the sebaceous glands are in the dermis. The eccrine are mostly deep in dermis. Apocrine are deep in the dermis. And then ceremonious are going to be in the subcutaneous layer, so far, far deeper than what we see some of those other types of glands. The termination of the excretion duct, you can see here, the excretory duct are going to be mostly connected to the hair follicle. Apocrine as well is the hair follicle. The eccrine is going to be the surface of the epidermis, and then the surface of the external auditory canal. So you can see here that where the secretion occurs, I guess my labeling wasn't too bad a few slides ago, because both sebaceous and apocrine can essentially terminate in the hair follicle. And then lastly, the types of secretion for these different types of gland. And so here for sebaceous gland, this is the sebum. That is, again, providing kind of an oil protective layer for skin. The eccrine, you've got perspiration, which actually has ions in it, and urea, uric acid, ammonia, glucose, and lactic acid. The apocrine, sweat that's produced, but it compose lipid and proteins as well that can provide some of that smell. And then this ceremonious is going to produce cerumen, this waxy material, or as more commonly known as earwax. So the ceremonious is producing cerumen in the ear, producing earwax. So eccrine and apocrine both produce sweat, very similar components. The eccrine has all of these components, the ions and the uric acid, ammonia. The apocrine, again, maybe tends to be a little bit smellier. Functions. So like I said, the sebaceous prevents hairs from drying out, loss of water from skin. You actually lose milliliters of water through your skin. Even if you're being completely sedentary, you'll lose at least 200 milliliters of water, which this is 500 milliliters. So that's quite a bit of water being lost from your skin. The eccrine sweat glands are going to be very important in thermoregulation. So if you're hot, it's going to produce a sweat that's going to cool you down, helps remove waste like the ammonia that we talked about in the last slide, can be stimulated during emotional stress. And so that's that fight or flight response. And we'll talk about how the nervous system produces that type of response when we get to that chapter. The apocrine sweat gland is stimulated during emotional stress and during sexual excitement. And so again, that smell that's produced is maybe part of an evolutionary advantage to finding a possible mate in actually mating. So it plays that type of evolutionary role. And the ceremonious gland impedes entrance of foreign bodies into the ear. So again, earwax is not always necessarily a bad thing. It's protecting your ear from the external environment, keeping water out of that, preventing microbes from entering. But too much earwax can be a bad thing. So, but again, earwax does provides a nice waxy protective layer for your ear canal, especially since it's interacting with the outside environment. Okay, so when do these glands actually function? Sebaceous is relatively inactive during childhood, active during puberty, soon after birth. Eccrine, again, allows you to sweat. Apocrine sweat glands are as important or develops during puberty, again, when you're becoming more reproductively viable. And then ceremonious glands are also active soon after birth, as I can attest to because my kid produces a lot of earwax. It's weird. Not a lot, but just enough to be like, huh, didn't realize babies had earwax like that. Okay, so the next accessory structure that we have here would be nails. So these are keratinized epidermal cells in a much tighter packed structure. So if we look at the overall structure of the cell, you can see if we break down the structure of a nail, you've got your free edge, which is that lighter white part of your nail. Next, you have the nail body or the plate, and then the lunule, which is that white part at the base, and then your epokynum, which is your cuticle area, and then kind of closer to your the base of your hand would be the nail root. This is the dorsal view of the nail, and we're going to look at another kind of another side view of the nail here in a second. Here we go. So the sagittal section of the nail that you can see here looks slightly different because we're looking at the nail from a sagittal section, which is from the side. You can see the nail root located here. That's kind of not visible. That's looking very deep into your finger. Epicondyle or the cuticle located here, which is going to protect that kind of those first cells that are coming out. The nail, which is the thick white part of the nail at the base. The nail bed is just below that nail plate, and the nail visible portion body is the portion. Nail body is the part that's visible, and then that free nail edge that turns white again at the very end that you see there. Which, if we look deeper to those structures, we can also see the different parts of the finger that are present. Things like the epidermis and dermal layer are still present here, and then you can even see some of the finger bone also present as part of this sagittal cross section. This is just an phytomicrograph of a fingertip, so this is just kind of this cartoon structure here. You can see what it would actually look like if you were going to do a sagittal section of an individual's finger. Okay, so we've talked about the different layers of skin. We've talked about the cells. We've talked about the different types of glands. Now we're going to talk about types of skin. So thick and thin skin, which we talked a little bit about previously in those two characterizations. So the thick skin, not surprisingly, palms, surface of the digits, and soles of your feet. We talked about how there are layers of the epidermis present in the thick skin versus the thin skin. Thin skin is going to be all other body parts except for those we just discussed. In terms of the thickness, it kind of, again, lends itself to that thick versus thin skin. The thick skin is 0.6 to 4.5 millimeters, and the epidermal thickness of your thinner skin is 0.1 to 0.15 millimeters. If you want to think about kind of the very prototypical, like, thickest and thinnest parts of the body, think about the heel. Your heel of the sole of your foot is going to be part of the thickest parts of your epidermal layers, and one of the thinner parts or your thin skin would be your eyelids that cover your eyes. So in terms of the epidermal strata that are present in both of these, your thick skin, not surprisingly, are going to have that stratum lucidum present, and that thicker stratus spinosum. You're obviously going to have more cells present for that thicker skin, and also the presence of that additional layer. And then in thin skin, you've got the stratus lucidum that's actually completely absent, and actually thinner layers of some of the other strata as well. So thick skin versus thin skin. Thick skin, palms of hands, soles of feet. Thin skin is basically everything else. There are more layers, obviously, in thick skin, and the thick skin has that additional epidermal layer as well. So that's kind of a quick synopsis of the thick and thin skin. As terms of what the structure of that is, you'll see in thick versus thin skin. So in thick skin, you actually have these epidermal ridges. And so if we go back and look at kind of the outermost layer, the corneum of the epidermis, you'll notice that there are ridges between your fingers that are producing your fingerprint, and they are well developed here. What they're doing is they're increasing the surface area of your skin, allowing greater contact points for, let's say, interpretation of external stimuli. They're also going to have far more sensory nerve endings in things like your fingertips versus, let's say, the back of your neck. And so there's a lot more innervation in some of your thick skin areas. Your thin skin does not have as many epidermal regions, like the sides of your arms. You don't have fingerprints on the sides of your arms because you don't have those epidermal ridges present. Hair follicles and erector pili, again, the idea of the presence of hair and the ability for your hair to raise up on the back of your neck or on your arms. In thin skin that is present, in thick skin that is absent, you do not have hair present on the palms of your hands that gets activated if you're cold. Sebaceous glands are present in thin skin, absent in thick. Sudoriferous glands are fewer in thin skin, more numerous in thick skin, and sensory receptors are going to be sparse in thin skin and dense in thick skin. So again, in your fingertips and your toes, you can use your fingertips to interpret sensory information. So it's important you have a lot of those pressure sensors present in the tips of your fingertips. Okay, functions of skin. So what does skin do? You're probably going to get tired of me hearing talk about protection as well as synthesis of vitamin D and helping break down it down into calcium. So thermoregulation, it helps you keep you the right temperature, right? If you are cold, it elicits the standing up of the hairs on your arms. Those erector pili get activated, your hair stands up, and it starts to try to warm your body. Other ways it's warm, you can warm your body is through the activation of your underlying muscles that produce shivering, but your skin is going to be essentially bringing in the information to tell you that the outside of your skin is cold. Also, if we think about if you're too hot, your body's going to produce sweat. That's going to help, the evaporation of that sweat's going to help in cooling your body. So it's important for homeostatic thermoregulation for sure. It's also a reservoir for blood protection. We've talked about that numerous times already, and how there's immune systems that are present on the surface of your cells. So it's kind of the first line of defense against outside invaders. Cutaneous sensations. So it's very important that we're able to interact with our environment, that we're able to feel and touch and regulate our response to that outside environment. So it gives us that opportunity to interact with our environment. Excretion and absorption, so we're excreting different types of oils, and then we're absorbing things like sunlight and water sometimes through our skin. And lastly, synthesis of vitamin D. So thermoregulation, like I said before, production of things like sweat that are evaporated from the surface of the cell to cool it, and blood flow to the dermis if we're cold can actually increase our surface body temperature. Has so many blood vessels, about 8 to 10% of our total flow is located there while an adult is at rest. So it is holding a lot of our blood. Okay, so in terms of protection, again, the outside layers of the cell, you've got the production of keratin, lipids released by laminar granules. We saw the presence of those laminar granules kind of in the deeper layers of the epidermis. Those laminar granules are going to produce kind of a waxy substance or a waterproof coat the outside of the skin. And then next you have sebum. Sebum is released by the glands that we spoke about earlier. Acidic sweat, acid, as we know, is not necessarily always advantageous for the outside of cell walls, and so it can compromise microbes on the surface of our skin. Things like melatonin is going to produce, or the melanocytes are going to produce melanin, which are going to protect the nucleus of those cells and prevent UV damage to those cells. And lastly, macrophages are kind of the first line of defense of the immune system. They can go ahead and find invading cells and consume them via phagocytosis and prevent bacterial infection of the outer parts of our skin. In terms of cutaneous sensations, again, it's very important that we're able to interact with our external environment. And so things like tactile sensations, so touch, pressure, vibration, tickle. We need to be able to detect all of these things in our environment. So we have sensory receptors that are present in our skin that allow us to detect each and every one of these sensations. Just imagine how different your life would be if you couldn't feel pressure, and how hard it would be for you to operate in your everyday life. Thermal receptors are also present, so we're able to detect when something is cool or when something is too hot. And so being able to detect those wide variations in temperature allows us to respond and possibly avoid any type of dermal damage. And lastly, pain, which kind of leads me to the next type of cutaneous sensation. It's important that we are able to detect pain and avoid and prevent ourselves from further exposing or causing damage to the surface of our skin via these pain receptors. So, excrete and absorption. So it eliminates substances from the body. We talked about some of the glands previously and what they excrete. Talked about how they excrete ions and ammonia, for example. And these elimination of substances are substances that are need to be removed from the body. We're able to absorb things through the integumentary system. So things like there's a certain amount of water that gets we absorb from our environment, but also things like vitamin D. That exposure of vitamin D is again what helps us synthesize or not synthesize, but it is in the production of free calcium in the body. Lastly, for those of you who are going to be pharmacists, things like transdermal drug administration. So you can think of maybe personally, if you've ever been given a drug in the form of a cream and they ask you to apply it to the surface of your skin. So there's some anti-inflammatories that can be produced this way. There are some steroids that can be administered this way. But in order for a drug to be able to be effective, it has to be able to cross the dermal layer. So this is just, again, one example of a drug administration route, which, again, if you're going to become a pharmacist, you'll talk a lot about drug administration routes and how it makes those particular types of drugs available for the body. ADME, you'll hear a lot about ADME in pharmacy school. So synthesis of vitamin D, you can see from that very first slide where we talked about homeostasis, how important this particular role of the integumentary system is. So these UV lights actually activate the precursor molecule that allow vitamin D to be made, and it aids in the absorption of calcium from foods in the gastrointestinal tract. So it's important for vitamin D to be administered regularly. In infants, sometimes they aren't getting enough vitamin D, so they actually have you give them vitamin D drops so they can absorb more calcium from their foods in the gastrointestinal tract. And as we'll learn, calcium is very important in a lot of different functions. Again, if you go back to that homeostasis slide, you can see how many different times in the different body systems the role of calcium is essentially utilized as the role of the integumentary system's interaction with that system. So the muscular system, obviously calcium is very important. We'll talk about how calcium ions actually lead to muscle contractions when we get to that, because again, that seems to be a point that most folks get excited about. Okay, so the integumentary system, how does it heal itself? So if we look at different types of wound healing, so wound healing is going to kind of depend on how deep the wound is. So superficial wounds, for example, like if you have a paper cut or just something that kind of slices your skin, the very surface of your skin, those are considered superficial wounds. And you basically can have that basement membrane, and the basal epithelial cells are going to migrate to that site of the wound, and you'll have the rapidly dividing the cells actually replace that region of damage, and the other types of cells will slowly but surely from the bottom up start to die, and you'll replace those top layers of the thickening epidermis. So you have cells from neighboring regions kind of migrate in. So if you've ever, again, had a paper cut, it'll kind of heal itself from the sides in, because you'll have those rapidly dividing stem cells from that basal, stratum basal, be replacing that region that was originally damaged. Deep wounds are slightly different. Again, you're going into far more deep layers of the skin, and so that's going to require maybe a little bit more of a response from your immune system will get activated. Not that it's not activated in your superficial wounds, but deep wounds you actually have to have your circulatory system allow for a blood clot to be formed. And this clot essentially is going to act as a plug as the underlayers of the dermal layer are repaired. And then once those underlayers are repaired, you slowly but surely have the replacement of your epidermal layers as well. And then kind of that scab forms on the outside of that wound, and again serves as a protectant until all of the underlying deep layers have undergone the repair. So it's important to again recognize that in a deeper wound, you'll probably sever a artery, not an artery, but you'll sever the blood vessels that are vascularizing that region, and that's going to allow for the release of things like the neutrophils and monocytes that are flowing through your blood. And so that's going to be recruiting other inflammation, other inflammatory factors to that region, and they're going to essentially help in the repair of those deeper layers of the dermis and the epidermis as well. But again, the scab plays a important role. You have to have blood clotting that occurs here. So kind of the first step of deep repair would have the formation of a blood clot in the outermost region, so the internal areas can undergo repair. Okay, so in terms of the blood, or in terms of the integumentary region, how does it age? So as age or time passes, you're going to notice that there are going to be things like wrinkles and dehydration and cracking. Your skin just becomes a lot less pliable. Overall, you're not going to be sweating as much as, again, you get the farther away from puberty you get. Your functional melanocytes decrease, which results in gray hair and atypical skin pigmentation. So we talked about hair and how melanocytes kind assist in that coloring. And once you loses melanocytes, that's how gray hair occurs. And subcutaneous fat is lost and the skin thickness decreases. So you're again getting a little less protection on the surface of your skin. So if you maybe visit your parents or even your grandparents, you would notice that the skin on their bodies just tends to be a little bit thinner. You're able to see veins and arteries a little bit easier on the surface of their skin, and it's again because they're losing that subcutaneous fat and skin thickness overall. Their dermal and epidermal layers are going to be decreasing. Nails may become more brittle, and again, it's just a product of sometimes we talked about how food and nutrition absorption is a little bit more elevated as you're younger. As you get older, not as much, which could lead to some of the nail brittleness. In terms of diseases that can also result in the integumentary system, if you have excessive exposure to UV light. So as I talked about earlier, UV light causes DNA damage, which can lead to cancers. UV light is one of the most common reasons for skin cancer. The three types of skin cancer that can occur are the basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and malignant melanoma. And each one of those different types of skin cancers kind of has different characteristics. So you can see that if you look at, so often moles are going to be an indicator of skin cancer. So if you look at, not all moles are going to be cancerous though. So mole is also called a nevus. This, you can see a very normal nevus where you have very distinct borders, a very equal coloring across all of the nevus. In the case of basal cell carcinoma, you can see that there are a lot of uneven borders here. Squamous cell carcinoma, again, you see uneven borders, a flattening and a different pigmentation. And a malignant melanoma here, again, these very uneven borders, different coloring patterns across the surface of that. Basal cell carcinomas are probably a little less benign, or are more benign than maybe a malignant melanoma, which is something to be a little bit more concerned about, is because it can metastasize and move to different regions of the body. So another type of, I hate to say disease, but another thing that can happen to the integumentary system since it's exposed to the environment is burns. So this is a burn. If we define what a burn is, it's excessive heat, electricity, radioactivity, or corrosive chemical that breaks down the proteins in the skin and causes them to no longer be covering the region in which they were originally exposed. So they're graded according to their severity. So you've probably heard of first degree and second degree and third degree burns. So if we look at kind of how those degrees break down and how they're characterized, a first degree burn is very superficial. It only affects the epidermis. So a sunburn is a great example of a first degree burn in an extreme case. Second degree burn, here you can see that it affects both the epidermis and the dermal region. So if you, let's say, grabbed a hot pot, which it looks like maybe was the case here, that looks like a kid's hand. You can see here that touching a hot surface can cause blistering of it and actually cause disruption of both the epidermal and dermal layers. And then a third degree burn is going to disrupt the epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous layer. And you can see kind of the third degree burn that's present on this person's hand here. And again, I think often think of burns as a product of heat, but it can be due to corrosive chemicals. So extreme acids or bases can burn the skin, as well as radioactivity and electricity. So these are all different ways in which the skin can be damaged, not just by heat. Lastly, you can see here that the disease state that can occur are things like these pressure ulcers. So if somebody is not necessarily moving a lot, which we see with an older population, again, who maybe has a more compromised immune system, you can be susceptible to things like bed sores. So this is when epithelium is, there's a deficiency of blood flow to the region, so you don't necessarily see all of the immune cells being circulated to the region. You don't see enough circulation to the region, so these pressure ulcers can develop if you don't have enough circulation to the epithelium. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 5. Please make sure that you work your way through the study guide questions for chapter 5. And if you have any questions or concerns about this chapter, please feel free to reach out and let me know. Thank you so much.